Okay, hi everyone. So, full disclosure, we haven't actually practiced this all as a single, so we're going to see how this goes. But we've been in conversation now for months, and so hopefully the vibe continues. So today we're presenting on I'm going to say a problem and the first 10% of a solution to an issue that came up with some of the work that Sophia was doing with the Critical Pacific Islander Studies Collective, making a Pacific film database. So I think we're going to start with the context and just give you a little bit of background, and then we'll go on to talking about some of the issues. We'll talk about where we're at, and then we'll talk about going forward and a sort of minor plea for help and assistance, because this has been doing our heads in for months, and if I never have to think about tiny atolls in the Pacific again, it'll be a sad future, but it would also be a kind of a relief. So, do you want to go?
Sure. I'm just pulling up my notes. Cool. Whatever. So basically, when I first came to Berkeley, I was coming from Saipan, the capital island of the Commonwealth of Northern Mariana Islands. I was a filmmaker, and I was really interested in making it possible for other Pasifika filmmakers to find each other, because there's not really one place where we can all see what's being made. And I thought that was important because those of you who might be aware of like the CNMI or Guam, these are places where if you're born there, you're a U.S. citizen, but you can't vote. And so a whole slew of issues goes unaddressed by the federal government, issues that impact your moral health, way of life, environment, economy. There's just there's no representation, there's no political pathway or a way to participate in like traditional democratic practices. So my curiosity was, could we be like the Puerto Rican island of Vieques that was able to get a military installation removed through popular media? Could media be an outlet for getting some of this political work done? And so I wanted to see more networking and more funding going to filmmaking in the Pacific, and I thought, let's just make a map. And you can look at all these different islands and see what films came out of them, who's making stuff, and funders can potentially find filmmakers, filmmakers can find community, film lovers can find films. And we got started on our data set, and I was tripping over stuff right away, just because, like, what nation do I put for the U.S. Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands? It's technically a sovereign bilateral agreement, or a bilateral agreement between two sovereign entities. So is it the Northern Mariana Islands or the U.S. under nation? Saipan, or within the Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands, they have their own House of Representatives, so 2 senators from each island. Saipan has senators like a state, basically. But when you mail something there, you put Saipan where you would put California. You put Saipan where you would put Berkeley or Tacoma. You put it like a city. But Saipan has villages on it. So do you put the village, like, do I put Saipan under state or under city? And so I thought I had these like simple questions for Clancy, and it turned out to like explode the map, because basically these methods of categorization don't reflect how the islands work in the U.S. Commonwealth of the Northern Mariana Islands and across islands. There's freely associated states. There's all kinds of stuff. So yeah, that's how we got started. Go ahead.
Yeah, and so basically, Sophia comes to us and is like, okay, so a map. And I was like, okay, tell me about what your geographies are. And I was like, oh, no. And so I thought, look, as is the kind of tradition in the studio that I have built, is we start from the space and the place. We don't start from the map. And so I was like, okay, well, what kind of spaces are we talking about? What kind of geographies are we actually talking about here? What are the categories in which this database has appeared, rather than trying to sort of transform it? And so we looked a little bit into questions around oceanic mapping. Like, there is a really strong oceanic mapping tradition, many traditions actually across the islands, from You can read this incredible book by Renee Poulani-Lewis about hula. You've got poetry as well, different kinds of reckonings with the problems of cartography. This is Craig Santos Perez, who is based in Hawaii but is Chamorro. You've also got a really strong tradition of navigation as well, and different kinds of imagining, whether that's the work of Papa Mau, and I think if you were at AAG, there was an incredible presentation by Nonoa Thompson about the Hawaiian Renaissance and the sort of resurgence of traditional navigational techniques. And you've also got other forms of maps, like the Rebelibs from the Marshall Islands. So we've already got this tradition of understanding islands. The issue is that these traditions, what it means to be island, kind of sits perpendicular to the history of mapping in the Pacific. And I think this is a really good example. So this is a map by Tupaya, made for Lieutenant James Cook on his voyage around the Pacific, and it has baffled academics, scholars and cartographers for years. There was a recent piece put out by Lars Eckstein and Anja Schwartz, I think in the Journal of Pacific History, where they try and decode it, and that just created a whole kind of uproar where historians were piling on and they were piling back on, trying to figure out how this map actually worked. And this was made by Tupaya for Cook's crew because he found that the navigational techniques that Cook's navigators were using were actually really dangerous and not particularly useful in an oceanic context. So he made this to try and teach them a different way of thinking about the ocean, but where we're still not wholly sure how to interpret it. And meanwhile, the traditional form of mapping, and this is the problem that Sophia sort of runs into, is actually really steeped in a really problematic, ongoing settler colonial vision of the Pacific. From seeing the Pacific as a space, like the idea of the theatre of the Pacific as a war zone, or a space that you move through, or a space that is strategic and territorial, in that the region only matters insofar as the powers around the rim are fighting over and trying to establish particular strategic positions. You also have a kind of imagination of the unknown, the islands at the very far edge. And so this map is New Guinea in Makeda, in Makeda's map. And then you've also got the really problematic racial categorizations that appear as early as 1832 that are sort of saying Micronesia, Polynesia, and Melanesia. And there's a huge body of scholarship that also talks about the way in which that perpetuates racial capitalism and justifies settler colonialism, and actually creates division amongst the Pacific as well. We also have more contemporarily an obsession with the ocean floor as well for potential oil, mining, coal deposits, and so you've got a lot of maps that focus on the sea floor, and also maps that focus on resource. And so there's contemporarily most people who are doing mapping of the Pacific are government agencies, military, aeronautical companies, and then development and aid organisations as well, which have their own problematic. So we're not really coming into a space that's particularly hospitable to the kinds of questions that Sophia was asking, which just led to a hell of a lot of issues. This is you, Elizabeth.
Yes, so when we get to the fundamental question of how do we geolocate these films, we've got where the directors are from, where the film actually takes place, where they're associated. We've got all this information. How do we best represent that spatially? And what we came down to was using islands as this fundamental unit of spatial representation. But as Sophia got into a little bit, we've got this complexity of ordinal classification. We've got physical classifications like islets that build up into islands or atolls that you can then see as greater island chains or island groups. But with these films, most of them are context-based in political and administrative boundaries, and so we wanted to tackle the issue of getting at this administrative classification. So this was my trying to go through and understand what is out there, a non-exhaustive list of all of these categories in rough descending order according to sovereignty. And it is so messy and it's very weird. It's context dependent and very based on the exact nation that has jurisdiction over these islands, the exact islands. And it is, very difficult to represent, but by using islands as this fundamental layer, you're able to build up these groups in a way that's much more flexible than starting at the nation or the Commonwealth or the territory level in the first place.
The problem is that there are no shapefile sets that really deal with this on a generalised vision of the Pacific. And so we have this incredible island category, and we have no shapefiles with which to attach them. And in fact, there is no single category across all of the islands that we could find that we could actually attach anything to. Like, we could not bring all of the Pacific Islands together and say we're going to join this column to this column. We tried several ways. It was quite interesting to watch a whole bunch of films end up being located in Oklahoma because the only place they seemed to connect to was the United States, and they just defaulted to the centre. So we've got this really hegemonic problem of levels. It's deeply uneven. It is also, like, this is OpenStreetMap. It's embedded in everything, and I think as well, like, it's also super uneven. So, like, for instance, America Samoa, District of Columbia, Guam, Northern Mariana Islands are all on the same level. But Samoa itself is a level 2, which is a country. But then if you look at different data sets, they will also have American Samoa as its own country on equal footing to Samoa. And then even if you get in, as Sophia was saying, like, the Northern Mariana Islands have municipality, which is an island or an island group, whereas Guam has municipality as a village. So Guam's allowed to have villages, Saipan does not have villages. And so there's this kind of complex problem. And we've used this sort of, like, we're working with this idea of hegemony to try and help us think through and deal with this problem. Banu Vanuama talks about that this has been like the legacy of imperial networks. John Connell talks about them as being impossible geographies. And Sue talks about it as being a settler colonial imaginary, but it's somehow more than that when you bring it into the cartographic, because you're talking about these distinct relationships that are hierarchalized as well. It's not just flat, it's kind of made vertical as well. And this is just a kind of example of the different kinds of spatialities that we're dealing with as well. And so often these data sets are also split out into the different colours. So Australia will have good quality files for its own islands. The Pacific nations have there's like a free and open source sort of movement, FOSS, Geo and Oceania, who are trying to work with that, but often they are actually just focusing on the Grey Islands. They're not focusing on the US imperial territories. It's honestly a nightmare, and I have nightmares about it. Then on top of that, we have another problem.
And I'll be faster because I found my speaker notes. So what do you call the islands is also contentious, right? New Zealand or Aotearoa, Truk or Chuk, Guam or Guahan. Because of the history of colonialism in the Pacific, one Pacific island may have numerous names, and name choices can be associated with different eras, orthographies, and positionalities. Most Americans have heard of the island of Guam, but it's called Guahan by supporters of the Chamorro decolonization movement. The Chamorro word Guahan means ours. Their theory is that Spanish colonizers asked something along the lines of, what is this land? And Chamorros, maybe working off of context clues and body language, answered in Chamorro, Guahan, as in, this is our land. The island was called Guahan until it was signed over from Spanish to U.S. rule in the 1898 Treaty of Paris, in which it was inexplicably called Guam, and out of ignorance and indifference, the name has stuck ever since. So when we map this island, which name we choose indicates which version of history we see as valid and who we believe has the right to name a place.
Okay. Finally, the ocean is not a surface, okay. This is another problem as well. When you then, maybe in a world in which we can get these things on the map, we have this giant, big, blue, flat problem as well. And so the final is, it's in part a design problem, but it's in part an also sort of imaginary problem as well, which is that when you zoom out to see the entire Pacific, you can't see any of the Pacific. You can only see blue. And I think this underpins this idea that the ocean is always represented as a kind of flat surface as well in most standard maps. So it's either the surface of whatever we assume means sea level to be, even though we know that that's really not a standard kind of thing, or it emphasises the bottom of the ocean, which of course perpetuates that imaginary. I mean, most Pasifika people don't live on the bottom of the ocean. That has a particular interest for certain military industrial resource extraction efforts. So the map, where are we? We have got a map on the internet. That is what we have done so far. We have begun to solve two issues. One is working from the seminal work of Epeli Haofa in 1994, A Sea of Islands. We're trying to reimagine, well, what does a sea of islands look like in the context of mapping? And how do we actually make it so that rather than there's islands in a far sea, and every time, Jim's showing the Mercator projection, it's cut in the Pacific right down the middle, how do we recenter the Pacific as a sea of islands and island shapefiles? And part of the problem as well is that an island is not a point. It is a shape. But maps love points. In fact, data maps love points. And so we've been poor Elizabeth has been slowly extracting island shape files and linking them into the Pasifika Island database. And we're trying to think about how we can actually make the connection so that when you find a film, you see the island, not necessarily some random point in the centre of the island. So you get this sense of completeness. To quote Haofa, a more holistic perspective in which things are seen in the totality of the relationship. We had a fun time exploding the Global Islands dataset. There are 269,391 polygons in that dataset. So, help. That's kind of where we're at, and we're having to do it a little bit by hand as we're sort of trying to manage our workload in the face of this enormous dataset. The second is this problem of the surface. One of the questions we have about the term hegemony is it's a Gramscian term largely. It's understood as being from Gramsci, but Sharad Chari, who's brought Gramsci's work into the idea of the ocean, takes hegemony as being this idea of two countries resemble the waves on the surface of the ocean which come and go capriciously, but deep down there is a strong historical current which leads to war. What do we make of these metaphors of surface waves and deep currents? And Sophia and I had a conversation about actually how, in many ways, compared to the depths of the Atlantic and the kind of conversations we see in, for instance, black geographies, the Pacific is actually a really lively, superficial ocean in which people are on it and moving across it, and we see that in the kind of navigational practices as well. And so I spent a fair bit of time extracting out the surface currents from the Copernicus database and turning them into vectors so that the map itself is not a flat surface, but actually shows something about the way in which the movement of the currents work, and that also says something about the movement. Sophia was telling me that to go from Saipan to Tinian, it takes how long?
Maybe like 2 or 3 hours.
2 or 3 hours to go from Saipan to Tinian, and then to go from Tinian to Saipan, it's...
like 8 to 10 sailing.
It's 8 to 10 hours?
Yeah.
Yeah, because you're moving against the current. And so the currents make the kind of relationality between that island. Okay, going forward. We are trying to figure out what names to call things and how to create a kind of hierarchy of names that will show Indigenous and decolonial movement names first, but will also have the others so that, it will default and then try and create something where people can actually send in names as well, or actually add names to that database, because actually a lot of nation states, particularly the US, are not very good at noting down those names, and even like the names themselves change. There is a book by Lee Motelier, but it's also it doesn't even have Guahan, and so it's quite limited, even though it's from 2006. The shapes.
Yes. And then for the shapes, with defining even like what an island is, we've included like atolls into that category. So like an island in our database is not necessarily a continuous landmass like surrounded by ocean. We've kind of had to adjust that. Current workflow has been very manual and not very optimal, but it's finding country-level shapefiles, getting those into ArcGIS Pro, exploding those, and using a spatial join to add the island names, getting those into GeoJSON.io to manually adjust boundaries, and to get those as a GeoJSON, and then assembling those island files into a base map layer on Mapbox. Moving forward, hopefully, I plan on starting with like a comprehensive data set of all of these islands, and then attaching the names there and having more islands than we need ready so that this data set can expand as the films expand.
Yes, and we're moving to geopandas because the numbers are getting big now that we've sort of figured out what needs to happen. And then we'll end where we started.
Yeah. So returning to the original intention to map Pasifika films and filmographies, with Clancy's help, it's become clear that executing this idea with its original values intact requires us to not only support Pacific Islander representation in films and the filmmaking process, but to support Pacific Islander perspectives in the world or the world-making process. And a critical cartographic approach to standard methods of mapping the Pacific reveals that Pasifika peoples have historically been left out of the cartographic process that defines who and where they are. I know that we're kind of running out of time, so I'll just say our hope is that this radical map can be used not only to offer visual representation of filmmakers and filmmaking in the Pacific, but whatever other decolonization processes Pacifica peoples want to map, like cultural perpetuation, movements, grassroots organizing, or intra-island political coalition building. The point is for Pacifica peoples to be mapped or not mapped, seen or not seen, for our own purposes, on our own terms. Yeah.
I don't know.
We have time for like one question.
Okay.
And look, it works. Well, ha!
Yay.
We have a map. Come on.
One quicker question.
Sorry.
Hello. Oh. Thank you. Very awesome. I identify with a lot of that. I've worked on some Pacific Island mapping recently. I'm just sort of like, check, problem, check, problem, check, problem. And for me especially, I was just going to say when you got to the design, that idea of an untextured, quote unquote, untextured surface and the invisibility of the dots. And one thing that I've toyed around with as a temporary solution is actually movement in the map. So like animation, interactivity, that kind of thing. Would love to talk to you more about it, and just curious if you've ever thought about those kind of design solutions.
I think the long dream for Sophia and I is something a bit like windy. But that means I'm going to have to return to JavaScript and 3D.js and figure out how to help. If anyone wants to give me some good resources on that, that would be helpful. But yes, that is the dream, is something like that.